Here we go, on to YouTube. And we should be live on both YouTube and Rumble. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. Tonight, we will discuss how Tennessee has officially banned child drag shows and gender mutilation for minors, and left-wing groups are already planning to sue Governor Bill Lee. Meanwhile, in London, sexualized drag queens are now performing for babies because depravity knows no end. Next, we'll discuss Tucker Carlson calling out Tim Keller and other members of Big Eva for their silence on Canada jailing a pastor who interrupted an all-age drag show. Finally, as a result of all these stories, we will talk about Matt Walsh and how he's a big meanie for being too blunt when discussing a transgender individual. We will use this opportunity to discuss how Christians should handle such sinful acts happening and increasing, unfortunately, in culture all around us. So it's Monday Night Live, so drop your questions in the chat and we will answer them at the end of each topic. Joining me tonight is regular co-host Michael Aper.
Howdy, friends. Pleasure to be with you. I love Jesus, and I want you to as well.
And that is why we are here, to talk about a bunch of horrible things, unfortunately. But some good things, and we'll start with some good news. So this is from the Tennessee Conservative. Governor Bill Lee signed 2 bills into law last Thursday that will protect children in Tennessee. House Bill 001, Senate Bill 001 prohibits gender-affirming care for minors who identify as trans, and House Bill 09, Senate Bill 03 makes it an offense for drag performers to provide sexually provocative entertainment in the presence of children under 18. Lambda Legal was quick to announce that they will sue the state over the new law that will halt gender-affirming care by next year. And just so we're clear, gender-affirming care is in quotations here. The law is set to go into effect on July 1st, 2023. Minors currently receiving puberty blockers or hormones opposite of their gender at birth will lose access to such care after March 31st, 2024. Lambda Legal is joined by the American Civil Liberties Union and the ACLU of Tennessee in opposing the new law. The law also provides a legal basis for patients who feel they were injured as a result of gender-affirming treatments to sue parents or guardians and the medical physicians who provided treatment. The law banning sexually obscene drag performances will take effect April 1st, 2023, a month ahead of Pride Month in June. So that's some updates on the Tennessee legislation that we've been following periodically throughout this channel. So, Michael, what's your initial thoughts on those new bans being put in place?
It's unfortunate that this is considered good news. That's kind of my take on it, is that our society is so fallen that that's a necessary measure that needs to be taken. Because it's not as easy as like, wow, a win for Christian conservative people, like whatever. That's not really a win. It's like mitigating damages. And what's unfortunate about it is that I think that there's going to be more damages that take place as a result. And the damage now, like they're talking about taking hormone blockers away from young people who are currently on that already, which means they're going to be denied the transition that they have already engaged in and in their minds have already fully accepted. But now they're not going to be able to affirm that bodily. And I'm not saying that they should be able to affirm that bodily. I'm saying that I foresee a greater amount of opposition to these bans that will probably have a harsher lashback than what we're doing even now. So I don't know. Maybe I'm pessimistic. What do you think?
So do you mean it like you think that people who already have begun transition are going to be so upset about the fact that they basically no longer can transition that you're going to see more people throwing fits about that than
kind
maybe
of
otherwise?
like they're, and I'm going to sound a little bit harsh in the way that I say this, but at the risk of sounding harsh, they're the product of a generation that embraces a victimhood mentality, and they're being dished up a case of victimhood where they can stand on that and show it to the world to see how horrible the oppression of people who reject transgenderism are. And I'm worried that for the people in the middle, or the people who are sympathetic toward or accepting of transgenderism, it will be a much more convincing measurement, or a more convincing cause against conservative values than just the truth of what a conservative would promote. Or even if not a conservative, I don't necessarily mean politically conservative, but ethically conservative, to say that we have our reasons for believing the way we believe. We believe that there are implications for health that are being disregarded. But people usually go towards the shiny thing that's right in front of them, and the shiny thing may end up being some poor teenagers who's halfway one gender and halfway the other because they've been on hormone blockers, and now they're just a mess and can't be one direction or the other. And they're going to blame the government or blame conservatives for making that their situation. So I don't know. That's maybe the potential that I see. Do you think I'm out of line in thinking that?
Oh, no, I think that you're completely right in regards to that's definitely going to be the narrative on the opposing side, 100%. I think what it honestly boils down to is willpower. Because like in the state of Tennessee, for example, overwhelmingly, I mean, even in our country, speaking broadly, including all the Democratic counties, the Republican counties, and what we would call swing counties, overwhelmingly, most people disagree with just gender transition surgeries, at least for minors. I mean, honestly, I think most people, I think it's like 58% disagree in general with them, period, regardless of age. But for minors, that number goes up. And so to some degree in the state of Tennessee, those numbers go up exponentially as well, because we're a much more conservative state than, say, California or New York. And so ultimately, I think it's going to be a matter of willpower. I think that there's going to be a loud minority. And this is something that happens, especially left-wing political movements. They will ship in people from out of states to go into Tennessee to make a big stink, because, to be honest, they kind of want to make an example of Tennessee. So it's just going to be a matter of willpower for the Republican leadership in the state to not cave to that, and even the culture to not cave to that, because what you're saying is correct. It's gonna happen. It's just a matter of will people cave to that.
And we know the bias of the media is not in our favor. So
yep,
that's why we're here speaking for truth.
Exactly, because even in Tennessee, there are very, very few conservative outlets. In fact, that's why, for those who have been watching the show, whenever I do mention Tennessee, I'm always quoting from the Tennessee Conservative, because, to be honest, they're kind of the only statewide newspaper that covers things from a more conservative perspective. Everything else is at best independent, but I honestly don't think there's really much independent voices outside of, alternative media in the state of Tennessee, despite it being one of the most Republican states in the entire union. It's just, there's just some weird aversion that people who have more conservative principles have of, like, not wanting to get into media. And I don't know why that is. Maybe it's just because it's so ugly. Honestly, it's an ugly job. But that is why we're doing this when we bring up Tennessee, is just try to fill in the gap a little bit. Not that we're necessarily a news outlet, but we are trying to bring news stories into the public eye and trying to talk through those. But now, that being said, I do think that you're correct about how the the alternative narrative is going to form. I think that you're spot on. I think it's just a matter of everyday people need to be more aware of what's going on with the perverse ideologies of gender affirming care and transgenderism and drag queen story hour, things like that. And that kind of brings us to our next story. I am going to check the chat really quick, though, in case I'm missing anything.
Yeah, Richard put up a good comment. He says, many people who don't have any real conviction to stand on, much less any biblical Christianity, see their virtue as standing with the victim, which is why we see people doing this with the LGBTQ stuff. I've added the Q, but I don't even know what the relevance of that is. So what Richard is saying is that when people don't have a moral compass of their own, then it's easy to see someone who's being victimized and say, well, that's not just, and stand on their own little pedestal next to those people. And I think that's why the media is allowed to be as effective as it is because there's so many people who are either uneducated or don't have ethical convictions about these issues. So they default to, oh, well, they're not being treated well, therefore it must be wrong. But, there's more to justice than happiness.
Yeah. And Richard, you'll definitely have to stick around in the chat because there's a story a little bit later on that we're going to cover that I think is really, I'd love you to send in some chats for that one. But yeah, I mean, kind of like what I was beginning to say a moment ago, I think the average individual, and this is something that you and I even talked about today while setting up this stream and planning for the episode. I think that the average individual in Christian America, in the greater Christian community, they try to be either apolitical or they just aren't paying attention, whether they're actively choosing to be apolitical or not. They oftentimes don't understand how bad things are getting in some of these areas of gender ideology. So that's kind of why I wanted to bring attention to this next story, because this is something that just happened recently. I believe it was over the weekend. So this is from the Post Millennial. A London entertainment company that puts on events for parents and babies featuring scantily clad drag performers dancing provocatively has become the focus of intense international outrage. The social media storm began when broadcaster Dominic Samuels shared video footage of a Kaba Baba rave event in which adult men wearing little more than thongs can be seen cavorting and gyrating in front of an audience made up of adults and infant children. One of the men is wearing tight black shorts and thigh-high stiletto boots while he twirls on aerial ropes. Another, wearing just a thong and high heels, performs an impressive balancing act upside down on a chair, leaving little to the imagination. This is a quote here. "We wanted to create the type of event we ourselves as mums would want to go to. There's only so many times you can listen to the effing wheels on the bus. We wanted to give parents the experience of a big London night out, cabaret, drinks, and dancing, but one you can bring your baby to and sit still, and still be home for bedtime," they explain. The events are aimed at parents and babies under 2. Skipping down a bit here. All the company's social media accounts are now set to private after the video clips were a storm of outrage. And skipping down a little bit more, one photograph of Kaba Baba Rave's now private Instagram shows a drag queen doing the splits with a crowd of mother and baby onlookers. Another post shows a screenshot of a message criticizing the inappropriate form of baby entertainment. Quote, "Wearing latex and drinking pints is not suitable for a baby event. Shameful," reads the message. "Yay, shame. Best review ever," is the accompanying caption. And then another response to that also said, "The parents that take their children to events like this should lose custody of their children, and the companies and people that put them on should be locked up. Absolutely revolting." And that was tweeted by Gays Against Groomers, which is a group of LGBTQ individuals who are absolutely not okay with the targeting of children. But I know there's a lot to respond there, but what were your initial thoughts, Michael?
Well, Shara Joel says, "Oh my goodness, good thing those babies aren't going to remember that garbage," in the chat. And on one hand, true. However, they're being raised by parents that see this as not just acceptable conduct, but desirable conduct. And that it's to be compared to going a night out on the town, but when you can go to bed by bedtime. That's the justification for advertising this specifically to mothers or parents of young children. Now, sure, you can say you don't remember what takes place at 2 years or younger, but there are patterns that form behavior, and behavior that form emotional maturity and emotional development that will impact the behavior of those children throughout their lives. And they are shaping the conduct that they are deeming as acceptable or as ordinary. And my heart breaks for a parent who can so selfishly say, it's more important for me to get what I want from this display of sexual conduct than it is for my child to be raised outside of a sexual context. Like, what they're saying is that my desire for this is more important than my child's understanding of a healthy sexual or a healthy relationship with sexual things. So they're normalizing overly sexualized behavior. And this has nothing to do with it being men dressed as women or whatever. It's purely sexual content. And I don't care if it's, a strip club or a drag show or just straight up hookers. It's kind of all in the same category of over sexualizing behavior. So why would it be okay to take any child to a cabaret? Why would it be okay, despite who it is doing the sexual activity? And then when you get into the fact that it's men wearing thongs, that adds a whole new layer of what are we normalizing in our culture? What are we normalizing for our children? Why is it that parents desire this? And given this is a select case in London, and it may be a specific few that are seeking it out intentionally, and I guess all in all, I'm glad to hear that people are in opposition to it, because God help us if this becomes such a normalcy that we wouldn't cringe at the idea of it.
Yeah. And honestly, though, like I truly do think, and this is, I'll actually ask, Shara, if you're still in the chat. Well, first of all, is it Shara or Shara? Because I want to make sure that we pronounce your name right. But so go ahead and let us know. But beyond that, I wanted to ask, aside from what we've mentioned tonight, have you been aware of these type of performances popping up all over both the country and across seas? Because in my experience, many individuals are just not aware that this is happening. And I honestly think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we live in a fast-paced society. And I truly think that there are distractions that I think the enemy wants us to be distracted with. It's so easy for individuals to get off work and just check out. They want to see the latest Marvel movie, the latest Star Wars movie. They're just like fixated on, honestly, just being what many people have referred to being plugged into the Matrix, to use a pop culture reference. It's being so obsessed with the latest TV show or the latest, activity to go do, the latest app, whatever the case may be, that so many people are just not aware of like these other things on the fringes of societies that are slowly becoming less and less fringe, more and more dominant. Because to be honest, 5 years ago, I think even some of these performances that we keep hearing about would not even be remotely accepted as normal. And yet here we are, we've talked about multiple of these on our podcast. And the only reason why we keep bringing them up is because they keep happening. And I think it's important to keep shedding a light on, because to some degree, someone has to sound the alarm that, hey, our culture is starting to normalize this. Hey, it's not just this one event here. It's, oh, hey, it popped up over here too. Oh, and over here. Oh, and next door, and unfortunately that is becoming a theme. But yeah, and Shara, you said that we got it right the first time. So awesome. And you hear about it. Yeah, I hear about it online, drag queen story hour at libraries, drag shows for kids, I think in California. And see, that's exactly my point. Unfortunately, Shara, that is not just in California. It's in Texas. It's in Idaho. It's in Tennessee. I believe it's been in Georgia. I'm sure there are many other states. I'm just mentioning ones off the top of my head that I know for a fact they have held these events. And there's been multiple in all of those states I just listed. So unfortunately, I think that's another thing. Many more conservative individuals kind of think it's staying in California, and we like to say, don't California my Tennessee, or don't California my Idaho, or don't California my Arizona, or whatever the case may be. But it's already being exported at a alarming rate. Yeah. I don't know if you have any thoughts about the whole Matrix analogy, Michael.
It's social conditioning, right? Like that's what the Matrix is all about anyway, is that, and what we're seeing here and why we can compare it to the Matrix is social conditioning. That if the voice you hear most often is normalizing behavior that no other voice would normalize, you'll still be accustomed to that behavior. And that's what's happening in this this weird sexual revolution of a sorts that we've had over the past 10 years, specifically, of going from homosexuality being talked about in sitcoms, accepted largely. I mean, that goes back to early 90s, is a pretty common thing. And now we've gone from homosexuality being largely accepted to now it's being celebrated when we were young. Mm-hmm. And not only now is it being celebrated, but it's being forced upon our culture, forced upon individuals who are not interested. We've gone from saying, okay, you shouldn't probably beat up the gay kid at school, to now, if you're gay, you're better than the straight kid. And if you don't affirm and celebrate the gay kid, then you are the bully because you're not believing the way that we believe. And therefore, you need to be ostracized in our community.
Yeah.
And now that's not just gay kids like it may have been over the past few decades. Now it's getting to a point where if you're a heterosexual male child that was born as a male, then there's probably something wrong with you and you're part of the patriarchy, because you had the option to choose to be a female and you chose not to. You had the option to define yourself sexually in one way or another and you chose not to. And this is besides the patriarchy. It's a whole complex, and we could get into a deep dive on the conspiracy potential there, but ultimately there seems to be a staggering evidence that our culture is being incentivized to abandon ordinary sexual behavior.
Yeah.
At the same time that they're being conditioned to believe that having more than one child is selfish. At the same time that they're being forced to consume products that have a history now and a evidential basis of sterilization. And I'm not just talking about vaccinations. I'm talking about cleaning products. I'm talking about even consumptionary products that are being put into our foods. All in all, it seems to add up. And I don't like to be the conspiracy theorist, but I don't want to abandon evidence and empirical data either. And we have media telling us that we have to abandon we have to accept unordinary sexual behavior, We should be shamed for having multiple children in a heterosexual relationship, and we should continue using products that are sterilizing us as a society, so that if we don't get euthanized, sterilized on our own means by a vasectomy or even by other contraceptive means, then we should be ostracized by that as well. And it's this weird, horrifying reality that we now live in. And it's not limited to American culture, clearly. Like London is having this going on for babies. It seems like there is great effort toward limiting our reproductive potential in society.
Yeah.
On an ideological front, on a physiological front, and I have a hard time believing that that is the intentional work of man. And I'm left with the thought that this is an act of the enemy, because we do battle against an enemy, and the accuser, the deceiver, Satan, the devil, whatever you want to call him, is certainly at work. And there seems to be an agenda at play in our generation that is certainly not unique to our generation, but we need to have our eyes open, and it's scary. This is just a small part of the story that I think is very disturbing.
Yeah.
But it adds up to one huge equation, and we need to be in opposition to that, because it's in opposition to Scripture, of the imperative that God has given us.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think that you did a good job building out kind of the micro versus the macro. And yeah, I think that you're completely right on the agenda that, it's hard to want to say that it's all human agenda. You mentioned the enemy. I think it's kind of a bit of both, because obviously the enemy works through man, but at the end of the day, I think it's these ideas are definitely not unique to our culture. And we now move from the timeline of, first it starts off with tolerance, and then it moves to acceptance, and then it moves to celebration, and then it moves to participation. And right now it feels like we are in the transition period between celebration and participation. And it's unfortunate, but that's just the reality where we find ourselves. And
I'd even say that with participation comes obligation. That it's not just enough to be accepting of the participation, but you have to participate. You have to be in favor of. Yeah, it's a disturbing reality. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Celebration. No, that's just really it. That's the celebration part that we're talking about. I mean, there's an entire month dedicated to Pride, which, I mean, I personally don't agree with the homosexual lifestyle, or, all the various new sexual preferences that are now arising every single day. But even if you have that belief that you don't have an issue with that lifestyle, you have to admit it's odd that you would have an entire month dedicated to your sexual preferences and being prideful of that. Like, I don't know, like, to me, like, Black History Month makes way more sense to me than Pride Month. I just feel like it's slightly trying to elevate my sexual preferences is the exact same as Black Americans having been previously oppressed in our country, and wanting a month to basically acknowledge their pain, which, you could say that that's overblown if you want, whatever the case may be. Just either way, I think that conflation is just, I would be insulted if I was a Black American by that conflation, but that maybe I'm off on that. But yeah, I wanted to go ahead and get into our next story, though, because this is a similar vein. We kind of are following a trend tonight, but this will open up kind of a whole other can of worms here. So this is actually from Tucker Carlson. It's direct transcript here. So, Canada has now become an atheist totalitarian state with amazing speed. And in Canada, it's now a crime to object to sexualized drag shows for children. You're not allowed to say a word. Late last month, a pastor in Calgary was violently thrown out of an all ages, in other words, for children, drag queen story hour for daring to object to the sexualization of children. Who committed the violence in that video? The guy on the ground was the pastor. Before we answer the question, some context will remind you that in Canada, showing any disloyalty at all to the Trudeau government could get your bank account frozen and your truck seized. So maybe you're not surprised to learn that that man on the ground, his name is Pastor Derek Reimer, who showed profound disrespect for Justin Trudeau's ongoing efforts to sexualize children and mutilate the genitals of children. Woke up yesterday to the police banging on his door and telling him he was going to be arrested. And this is the transcript from that interaction with the police. Why are you showing up at my home? You guys could have called me. You could have called me. This is the police officer. We need to talk about what happened over the weekend at Seton, right? Why do we need to talk about it? Because you're going to be arrested for it and charged. So we can deal with it this morning, or I can just put warrants out for you. Charged with what? Mischief and causing a disturbance. So that was directly the transcript from the interaction between Derek and the police officer. So this is back to Tucker here. Where are all the professional Christians? You have to wonder that again. Where's David French and Beth Moore and Tim Keller and all these people who are defending Christianity as actual Christians are being arrested for being Christians? Not a word. Well, today, Pastor Derek Reimer confirmed that a warrant was out for his arrest for hate crimes, and he was right about that. He was not overstating it because this afternoon, he was literally arrested. So I thought that was interesting because for those who don't know, Tucker Carlson is the largest name in news in general. Like, he gets the most hits on his nightly show, and he specifically called out a bunch of people that we would consider to be part of Big Eva, is the term that's been thrown around a lot. Just meaning influential people within the church as speakers, pastors, authors, all of the above. And I thought it was really interesting that he made a point to call those people out on his incredibly popular nightly news show. But Michael, what was your initial reaction to that?
Well, there's so much, because there's the actual story of the pastor himself. Then there's, of course, what Carlson is saying about it as well. Going back to the original story, I didn't watch the film that was taken of his interaction at the show, the drag show. What was the nature of his disturbance?
Unfortunately, and this is where, you could critique Carlson for it if you want, but there was not film of the interaction before he was kind of being thrown out. But as he was being thrown out, he was basically saying like, this is wrong, you should repent, this is wrong, and then he got shoved onto the ground. So that's kind of the only context that was really given. If there was more video, I haven't seen it. I don't think anything has come out of that, and that could just be because it wasn't on tape. But obviously he was trying to disrupt the drag queen story hour. So I don't know to what degree he was, I don't think there was any violence. If there was, I think we definitely would have heard about that. I think the police officers would have mentioned that. They said that he was charged with basically causing mischief. And so my guess would be he was probably trying to be loud and disruptive.
There's actual violence and there's perceived violence. And the perceived violence falls under the category of, you said something I disagree with, therefore I'm being attacked.
Right.
Which sounds more like what some people would categorize this as. So that's pretty much my assumption as well, even though of course I don't know. My guess is that he was in protest, and protest was unlawful in this case because it was protesting an agenda.
Yeah.
So clearly that shows the state of not California, Canada for what it is.
What's the difference?
Well,
go ahead.
There's still a big difference somehow.
There is, thankfully.
But lesser so than other states, but I digress. Yeah, for Tucker to go out and call out Big Eva, I mean, he's saying the quiet part out loud, right? It's the part that we've said on other stances before. And, on one hand, it's like, would they have said something if given time? Probably not. Not all of them. I think McDonald might. I don't know. There's.
Do you mean MacArthur?
MacArthur. What did I say?
You said McDonald. You did that in a previous episode too. That's great.
I don't know. I have books by both McDonald and MacArthur, and I get that mixed up. So, yeah, John MacArthur probably would be one that I could see speaking out earlier than any of the other listed individuals. But those are the same individuals that kind of showed their hand during COVID as well, and showed that they were willing to go belly up and kind of submit to the governing authority, is probably how they would say it. And, what's our response to that? Well, maybe they're justified because they're still pursuing the work of the kingdom in the midst of the tyranny. But perhaps the work of the kingdom is in opposition to the tyranny. So, I don't know. Yeah. It's a hard thing to tell. And I do honestly think that God has not called all of us to act in the same way against specific things. However, he has called all of us to specific standards of ethics. And I think this pastor who is in opposition to what's going on is doing exactly what he should do. But how many other pastors who are Bible-believing, faithful individuals are not at the drag show and not in opposition, or they're not actively in opposition, but they're in opposition ideologically? And does that mean they're not doing enough? I don't know. So in the same way, you can look at the big leaders and say, okay, they're not calling out this tyranny. So does that mean they're not doing enough, or are they just serving God faithfully in their own communities? And I think what it comes down to is when you have a platform like Timothy Keller, the others you mentioned, goodness,
David French and Beth Moore.
Yeah. Like Beth Moore, she's got an audience, and she has for decades.
Yeah.
So what she says from that platform is a reflection of her ministry. No, she tries to encourage people a lot, and she tries to be uplifting, and there's lots of ideas there. Tim Keller has written a lot of really good works. He's done a lot for the church, I believe. But could he do more? Of course. We could all do more. And I don't know. I think it's hard for me to start pointing fingers.
Right.
It's good that Tucker Carlson is calling it out. But I don't know if it's appropriate entirely for him to be pointing fingers at other evangelical leaders. However, he's not wrong either. So
yeah, and I think from my end, because I'm not a confrontational person, and that might shock people to hear, because I have a podcast that talks about politics. But the reality is, it took me a long time to really wrestle with the idea of even having this type of a platform, because I'm not a confrontational person. So that being said, I don't like to call out people individually, but I think it warrants a discussion, at least, not necessarily because we're here to call people out, but because there are trends that we can see with people. Like, for example, David French. I mean, I barely know his work, but every little bit that I've been exposed to, like, I will never try to question someone's salvation, but I do question his choices. That's for sure. Now, I wanted to bring up an actual example of someone who actually did respond to Tucker, who is considered not as high up in Big Eva, if we're going to keep using that term, as, you know, say Tim Keller or Beth Moore. But this is Mike Cosper, and he responded to it. He responded to it saying, "This is black belt level clown show. The story Tucker is talking about involves a pastor disrupting an event at a public library and refuses to leave. To call this totalitarian is an insult to those who suffer under actual totalitarianism." So that was his initial response, but he's gotten some backlash in the responses. So he actually goes on. He says, "Moreover, calling out Keller at all for failing to defend the faith by not speaking up in defense of the guy creating a physical disturbance is just plain stupid, and made more so by Wolf's claim that this is the most pressing issue of our day. Derek Reimer, the pastor, disrupted a public event and refused to leave. He now faces legal consequences. If I went into McDonald's sans shirt and shoes, demanding Big Macs and playing bagpipes, their refusal to serve me couldn't be chalked up to bagpiper persecution. There's this pretense that, as Kevin Williams recently said, one needs a snowplow attached to your truck to get through the all-age drag queens blocking the way to church on Sunday mornings. Acting like this is the issue in society is both pernicious and dumb. Dumb because it doesn't take a lot of poking around to realize that drag queen story hour, something that is also pernicious and dumb, is hardly a universal phenomenon. The founding organization's website lists about 36 chapters in the US. There are more that are unaffiliated, and there are other events like drag shows at Chuck E. Cheese, and yes, it's pernicious. Calling it sexualizing children is absolutely fair, but it is also nut picking. I'm assuming that's a typo. It is not some universal phenomenon. Here is what is universal. 1/3 of teen girls has seriously considered suicide. 1/5 of teen girls has experienced sexual violence in the past year. 1/10 of teen girls has been forced to have sex. That's the tip of the iceberg. Deaths of despair, addiction, mass loneliness, anxiety, depression. We have a rising generation that is suffering deeply. Some of the cultural malaise, some of its aftershock of childhood and adolescence disrupted by COVID, and in the church. Some of it is in the steady revelation that leaders turn blind eyes to spiritual and sexual abuse. Jesus committed an act of disruptive public violence one time when he turned over the tables in the temple. The authors of the Gospels make special note that he went after those selling doves, the acceptable offering of the poorest. This desire to cosplay at persecution and heroism exhibited by Carlson, Wolf, etc., is a distraction from real suffering and real harm, and far more pernicious than any story hour, regardless of how stupid and insidious that story hour may be. So I'll definitely read some responses to that, because that just continued to get more of a firestorm. But the reason why I bring that up is, I think, important, because what I'm trying to highlight here is there are people that are wanting to say nothing, and then there are people that I think are too quick to dismiss things as, oh, you're just playing at you're playing at the victim of saying, oh, you're so persecuted. But I think that they're doing that to a fault, in my opinion. But I'd like you to respond first, Michael.
The big hole that I saw in the response is he's saying there's greater issues at hand. And yeah, maybe so, because it's not universalized. It's not like every street corner has a drag show for children yet. But the examples that he called upon were young women experiencing a desire for, like, young girls experiencing suicidal thoughts, and over-sexualized youths that are being sexually harmed, manipulated, raped, persuaded into having sex. So in the same breath, he says, we can all agree that what's going on with these drag shows is sexualizing children. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that children are being sexualized.
Exactly. I'm so glad that you caught on to that too.
What? how can you not see that they are related? Now, of course, not every girl who wants to commit suicide or has been raped or has been persuaded into sexual actions is a result of drag shows. That would be
Right.
idiotic to
Of
assume.
course.
But, you know, he kind of made this comment of, this isn't the biggest issue in our society. And I want to say, it's hard to tell if it's the biggest, but it's up there.
Right.
It is defining our culture. It is defining our media. It is defining our news as well as our movies, sitcoms, TV shows, news feed, the algorithms that dictate what we're allowed to see on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook. This is all being undermined by this sexually charged agenda to cause people to think a certain way. And drag shows are one small piece in a big puzzle that point to that. So to ignore that is ignorant, I think.
Yeah. And what I think is interesting is I didn't really mention who this was yet to you, but this is Mike Cosper. I'm assuming I'm saying his name correctly, but he is the guy that actually chronicled the abuse of women at Mars Hill.
Mm.
So a couple of the responses that I thought were interesting, Ryan Visconti and several of these people I'm not super familiar with, but I thought they made good points, and they are, when I kind of did some looking into them, they are different authors, influencers within the church. So Ryan Visconti says, "No, Mike, that's basic courage for us regular Jesus people. A drag queen story hour is not a silly, foolish thing to tolerate. The sexual abuse of children is the darkest type of evil. The fact that you don't get that is scary. I guess all of us who want to protect kids are black belt level clowns." Then Joel Berry said, wait. Is Mike Cosper, the guy who chronicled the abuse of women at Mars Hill, shrugging off the abuse of little girls by grown men in dresses? And then last one that I'll read here is from Megan Basham, who's a well-known reporter for Daily Wire and multiple other outlets. She's been with several different Christian outlets over the years as well. She said, "If William Wolf has such a clown show take here, please point me to Christianity Today's coverage of bills currently passing and pending to stop doctors and hospitals from offering puberty blockers and trans surgeries to minors. I'm looking and not finding any." So that to me was really interesting to go back to, Timothy Keller and some of those other big names. Because Megan actually goes on her own feed to kind of give some more context that it was either the Gospel Coalition or Christianity Today. One of those sites basically, it was Christianity Today. There are multiple articles all covering gun control, for example, but nothing on any of these drag queen story hours or legislation being passed that we discussed at the beginning of this episode. I just find that really interesting. And so again, for those who are just tuning in, this is not necessarily us just playing blame game. We're honestly having a speculative conversation about why are certain individuals vocal about telling other individuals, you're being an alarmist about this, but then at the same time, they won't even bring up that it's happening. And I just thought that was really interesting, but go ahead, Matt.
I want to take a moment, if I can, to, I don't know if empathize is the right word, but at least assume a position of understanding Mike's perspective. Because, and I take this with a grain of salt, the individuals who were damaged by Mars Hill and took it upon themselves to document those damages, many of them have taken a position in the public view of saying, how can the church purge sin from culture if it can't purge the sin from within itself? Which is a reasonable thing to say, except that unfortunately it comes at the cost of being accepting or ignorant of the sins of the world. And this goes into a conversation that we've had before where it's like, okay, well, yes, the church should be fixed of its problems, but that doesn't mean that the church should turn a blind eye to the sins of the world either and just continue engaging in the public forum without a problem. Because in this circumstance, if we're going to take Mike's perspective, and this is all speculation, if I was going to take Mike's perspective, then I imagine him saying the issues and the grooming and the over sexualization of young women and young boys within the church and the history thereof is equally as damaging as what's going on in a heathen secular outlet. And we should turn our attention to that as a foremost priority. So I might say, like, yeah, you kind of got a point there, but also, what about those of us who go to churches where kids aren't getting raped behind closed doors?
Right.
And what if we are doing the work of the hands and feet of Christ and doing the best we can to protect the innocent?
Right.
Should that not extend beyond our borders and our walls? Should that not extend beyond the bounds of our church buildings?
Right.
Should not we also protect the innocent children that are being exposed to such debauchery before they have an opportunity to learn a proper ethical code? That it's a flawed argument. It's one that is somewhat compelling because it's emotionally stimulating. There's a lot of guilt and shame built into it for those who have been in an abusive or manipulative church setting.
Right.
But that doesn't give us an excuse to turn our backs on the innocent that are struggling in our community outside of the church.
Right. And, we've talked about this previously. This would be way back in the day. Some of our earliest episodes, we discussed, the stats on some of those sexual abuse stories in the church as well, compared to, like, say, the public education system. There's something like, I don't remember, I don't have the stats in front of me, but there's thousands of abuse of sexual abuse allegations and proven allegations, many of them in the public education system, but there's only a very, very small handful each year within just the entire, like, greater church community. And that doesn't mean that either is okay, because it's not. But to your point, Michael, I think it's really easy to throw a punch at the church because the church usually doesn't punch back. And I'm of course being metaphorical here, but it's frustrating. I think this is where a lot of the people that were responding to Mike is, it's frustrating to see someone who's within the church kind of being like, you guys are, feigning outrage over this one thing. And another person actually did commented, and they made a point to mention how in his response to Tucker's story, he made a point to not mention what the event was that this pastor disrupted. And someone was kind of saying, like, say the event name. What event was he disrupting? You conveniently left that out. And so if you were to only read his thread, you would think that this pastor just came and interrupted some random event, but it was actually a drag queen story hour for little children. And, most people are not okay with that. It's been polled. The majority of people are not okay with that. And so I think there's a frustration that many members of the church see when they see someone who has a platform within the church kind of basically tell the people that are trying to be awake on the watchtower, who are saying, hey, I think the enemy might be moving closer. And they're like, no, you're just imagining things. Like, stop ringing the alarm. Like, we're all sleepy. We don't want to wake up. Like, that's just what it feels like to me. And I think that's where a lot of individuals get really frustrated with.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no easy, there's no easy answer, because there's some validity to, you shouldn't overblow things. But again, like you mentioned, he mentioned all the sexualization of young girls, and it's kind of like, well, that's a result of a culture that's in decay. And that's kind of what we're trying to talk about when we bring attention to drag queen story hours or, gender transition surgeries for minors. Like, these are things that are becoming acceptable in our culture that should not be acceptable.
Yeah. The disturbing part, I think, about this whole story is that it's incomplete.
Yes.
And it's hard to make an actual assessment with good conscience without knowing the nature of the pastor's opposition. Because you could say, yeah, he's standing up against something that's clearly sinful and cool. It has certain John the Baptist vibes to it, very oppositional towards the governing sins.
Right.
But also, what if he did go in there and was blatantly disrespectful and cruel, and he could have been worthy of greater scrutiny than we'd like to think he is. That doesn't mean he's not justified in his opposition to what was taking place in a drag reading time. But I don't know. It gets difficult, because then I wonder if maybe we're not fighting hard enough against it. Maybe those of us who are comfortable sitting behind a webcam and talking about it ought to do more action in opposition.
Yeah.
Because it's easy. It's easy to talk to someone that agrees with me about it. It's a lot harder to sit there and be scrutinized not only by a room of opinionated adults, but also the law. So it's hard to not come to the conclusion that my hat's off to this pastor, no matter how he acted. But we don't know the full story, so it's hard to make a true, discerning, educated assessment of what is taking place and what the Christian response should be. But ultimately, the bottom line is he spoke out in protest, whether it was aggressive in nature or peaceful in nature. His protests were not only denied, and not only was he, you'd imagine if his protests were so incredibly vulgar or aggressive, he would have been escorted out by security or police at the time of the event. Since supposedly he was refusing to leave, and it's like, okay, well, where were the police when it was happening if he was refusing to leave?
Right.
How is it that they'd come to his door the next day and say, oh, by the way, what you were doing yesterday, your protesting was not acceptable because you were protesting the wrong thing.
Right.
Therefore, come with us, you're going to be charged and all this. Because that I can just hear Jordan Peterson's teeth grinding as he reads through some of this, because that's just a violation of free speech. And that's, from a governance perspective, just as disturbing in the free world as, I don't know, it's not as disgusting as what's taking place in these drag shows, but it's indicative of that cultural decay, just like you're saying.
Yeah. And Susie Q in the chat said, when the world holds to postmodernist relative standards, individual for each person, there is no actual standard to hold anyone to, which makes the church an easy target for criticism.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's no longer just. It's kind of like what we briefly touched on earlier, is that justice does not mean the promotion of happiness. Mm-hmm. Happiness is fleeting and temporary and usually flawed and a vice. So in relative morality, we have people who think that this makes me feel good, therefore this is right. This makes him feel good, therefore for you to stop him from doing this is wrong. That's not morality. It's not based in an ethical principle. It's not. If we're going to adopt relativism, then yes, it conforms to the mores of our society that have now deemed sexualizing children to be a social norm. And if that's our sense of morality, then we are so lost, and it's so heartbreaking.
It is.
But there are many who have defined our mores by biblical ethic, and even outside of biblical ethic, you can think of just the broad spectrum evolutionary benefits to society. How is it beneficial for children to be exposed to these things? How is it beneficial for adults to be exposed to men in thongs dancing and thrashing themselves around? How is it beneficial in any way to our culture or our evolution for men to engage in this practice anyway? Some might say it's an expression of an art form, but to what end and for what means? And in what way is this expression conducive to a structural society that is promoting unity, promoting success, promoting growth, and not even, because there's many people in that relativism camp that would not want societal growth, but surely they would want some semblance of order and progress.
Right.
Because that's what gets to me is like, okay, we come at it from a biblical perspective where things are clearly defined.
Right.
So from our biblical perspective, transgenderism, homosexuality, and drag is all outside of the realm of what is acceptable behavior within the life of righteousness. But if you want to abandon that entirely and say, let's say from an atheist or agnostic perspective of purely evolutionary benefit, what are the evolutionary benefits of this behavior? And I'm sure some people could pull something out of their butt. However, I don't get it. I don't understand it. I don't understand why there are people that see this as being beneficial. If it is an expression of art form or an expression of self, I can only see that it is defined in selfishness. The cardinal selfishness makes a man feel validated by getting the attention that he desires by over-sexualizing himself. And that attention feels good, therefore he continues to engage in it. And because it makes him feel good, then others are in support of it as well. But no matter what philosophy of social constructs that you can engage in, going back to whether it's the ancient Greek philosophers, even Carl Jung, looking at a variety of philosophers through all ages, I think egocentrism is vastly rejected as something of societal benefit. So, sorry, that's my tangent, because no matter how you look at it, it is not beneficial to our society at large. So it's purely selfishness.
Yep. I agree.
Cardinal sin, as we see it.
Yep. Once Upon a Reset in the chat said, we are blurring the line of what is an ethical principle and what is deemed a social norm.
Yeah.
I agree. And I wanted to kind of go for our next story here. Again, we're following this same thread. This is Matt Walsh kind of got in Twitter trouble. Yeah, for his message to Dylan Mulvaney. And Mulvaney is a transgender influencer who has done multiple things. I think he won Woman of the Year. He went viral for walking through the forest saying that it's day 66 of womanhood, and he honestly seems like a caricature of womanhood. He truly does. It does not seem like a genuine transgender individual, honestly. I don't agree with that lifestyle regardless, but this individual really seems to be overdoing it. This individual even met with Joe Biden and was advocating for, promoting access to gender transitional surgeries for minors. So that just gives you context of who Mulvaney is. So this is Walsh's original message to Dylan Mulvaney on his show that got him into trouble. So first I'll read his initial message to him, and then I'll let you respond to that, Michael, and then we'll read out what Walsh then responded to his critics after the backlash. So here's his original message. Dylan, if that is the most attractive you will ever look, then I don't even want to imagine what you'll look like when you're at your ugliest. You do not pass as an attractive woman or as a man at all, even with 50 pounds of makeup and plastic surgery and clever lighting tricks, even when you still cannot escape what you really are and what you will always be. You have successfully shed whatever parts of you were masculine, perhaps at least on the surface. Nobody would ever describe you as masculine or manly, so you've got that going, but your femininity quotient has not increased at a rate commensurate with the loss of your masculinity. You may not be masculine, but you also aren't feminine. Instead, you are weird and artificial. You are manufactured and lifeless. You are unearthly and eerie. You are like some kind of human deep fake. That's what you are. You are a man deprived of all the best qualities of men, but without any of the best qualities of women. Even your personality is contrived. Everything about you is fake. Nothing about you rings true. Nobody buys the act. You'll never be accepted as a woman by anyone. Never by anyone. Even the people who pretend to accept you as a woman are only pretending because they're afraid of being lectured if they don't, or because they want to use you as a platform to virtue signal. But everyone who looks at you will see something pitiable and bizarre, something utterly unfeminine in every way. You will never be able to actually have the identity that you're trying to appropriate, nor will you ever be able to fully escape the identity that you're fleeing. The best you can hope for is some kind of limbo, the worst of all worlds. And yet, even in that limbo state, you will still be a man, just not one that any of us can respect or take seriously. But other than that, champ, you're doing great. So that was his initial message that got him into a firestorm on Twitter. So what was your initial reaction to that, Michael? Is he just a big old jerk?
I can see why. And I guess I'm not entirely sure what Matt Walsh's prerogative is for writing that. If he is, like, he clearly has his agenda of defining a woman, and by doing so, identifying the failures and social venom that is transgenderism. He, I think, is undermining his cause in the way that he presented that. Because what he's doing is he's taking a full send commitment to ad hominem, the fallacy of character smearing. Basically, he took, what's his name, Dylan?
Yes.
Yeah. Her name, his name. He took Dylan's entire persona and violated it in the most public way possible, in the current most public forum possible. And I don't necessarily see the benefit of that. What it does is it drives a wedge between those who agree with him and those who disagree with him or think he went too far. My perspective on whether or not he's right for that, hearing the words that he said about this person who is clearly deeply broken and deeply confused about their identity, I guess my thought is Christ wouldn't want Dylan to be torn down in his brokenness. Christ would want Dylan to find himself, and in himself, but to find salvation and understand who the Lord is through love, and in so doing be formed by the Holy Spirit to walk in a path of righteousness apart from the sins that he has committed against his own body for such a long time. So it's really challenging for me. It's challenging for me to be on Matt's side on this. Now, I'm sure he's under fire because there's a lot of hateful, angry people on Twitter who are foaming at the mouth to find a way to stick a dagger in him and let him bleed out. And he served it up for him, the opportunity. So he clearly knew what he was doing by doing that. He was not afraid of the lashback, and nor should he be. He's in that category of individuals that has transcended, I think, the social lashback of getting canceled. So Matt Walsh is uniquely uncancelable for having this position. However, that doesn't make it okay or right. It hurts my heart to think of how Dylan would feel if he were to read and take to heart what was said. I can't imagine a way that those words would cause him to choose a better path. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have thoughts, and I think that I initially was in your camp. As time went on, though, and honestly, this is kind of my personality. I'm just not a mean-spirited person, and I am not a confrontational person. However, Walsh has a interesting response here, and I guess I'll read his response before I kind of go further on my thoughts on it. So this is him responding to his critics. It's a little long, but here we go. Needless to say, I don't apologize at all, nor do I wish to amend what I say or soften my language. I said exactly what I meant to say, exactly as I meant to say it, and I stand by every single word without the slightest bit of equivocation. I will also note that I did not insult Dylan Mulvaney in that clip. I merely described him as directly and honestly as I could. If honesty sounds insulting, well, that only tells us something about the nature of what is being described. Doesn't mean that we should stop being honest about it. Indeed, we need a lot more honesty, direct to the point, brutal at times. Why is honesty and the truth brutal? Sorry, guys, this is actually transcribed, so it's a little weird here and there. Well, because the reality of what we're dealing with is brutal. It is a brutal, horrific thing, and so there is no honest way of describing it without sounding brutal yourself. We have gotten to this point where depraved lies and destructive lunacy are destroying our country and consuming entire generations of children, largely because people have been too afraid to speak honestly and to say out loud what they know to be true. We have prioritized politeness and tolerance over truth. And look at where it's gotten us. Look what it has achieved. So if you, whoever you are watching this, and if you saw the clip of me addressing Dylan Mulvaney, and you thought to yourself, oh, that's mean. He shouldn't have said all that. I don't necessarily disagree, but that's mean. Well, if that's your reaction, then all that tells me, and what it ought to tell you about yourself is that you are among the legions who have sacrificed truth on the altar of nice. And the destruction that has followed from that decision is your fault. Okay? This is not a victimless crime. Your cowardice is not a victimless crime. These kids who have been abandoned to lies and despair and who are killing themselves because of it, that's on you and everyone like you. Now, you can't undo the damage that your cowardice has done, but you can at least get on the right side and start fighting for the truth. Now you can stop cooperating with the harm and thereby causing harm. Get on the right side of the issue, and you need to, because we are way past the point of being able to worry about nice. I mean, that point never existed. Certainly doesn't exist now. Now is a time for truth and nothing else. So he did give a little bit more thorough response in some of his videos after that, but that's kind of the quick gist of his responding to the critics. So after hearing that, Michael, what's your take on his sort of justification?
Well, I also want to read out of the chat. Susie Q said she disagrees with me. She said she thought what Walsh did was compassionate and necessary, Dylan Mulvaney is making thousands of dollars a month off his ungodly antics, and millions of people support him. So, something else to put in the mix, because I don't know anything about Dylan Mulvaney. It's
right.
I don't. I'll have you know, for those who are listening or watching, I'm processing all of this live as well. I haven't prepared for this conversation, so I'm getting it all fresh. And
yeah, and that's fair.
Yeah, I'll still say, after hearing Matt's response or rebuttal after his lashback, I will still hold to the idea that I still think his argument for cultural norms against transgenderism was still built upon a fallacy in that particular case. I don't think that it was as beneficial to so viciously describe Dylan. And I say vicious, but I'm not saying that it's not truthful. So yeah, there is truth to what he was saying. But the truth is not always effective, and the truth is not always helpful. The truth is not always loving. I mean, that's something that's been explored in many different variety of things. The truth is truth, but there are many different truthful things that he could have said. So to Susie Q's point that Dylan Mulvaney is making thousands of dollars forcing his ungodliness onto people who adore him, or her as they would like to think of him, I would have preferred to hear Matt aggressively speak out in opposition to his influence rather than his perception of himself. But I don't know, because all of the viewers of Dylan Mulvaney's media are going to hear Matt Walsh and demonize him because of the particular choice he made in how to approach the situation. Whereas it's possible, and maybe I'm just speaking in ignorance, it's possible that if Matt Walsh had chosen to pick apart from an argumentative perspective, to use proper rhetoric to highlight the damage that these young people are experiencing in their lives because of their body dysmorphia and gender dysmorphia as a result of having this idol who is so clearly departed from reality of his own being and his own self-perception. I think appealing to that would have a stronger argument and be more persuasive in opposition to Mulvaney, to Dylan Mulvaney. I keep looking over here to make sure I've got his name right, but I think that would be a more persuasive argument against his influence than just to highlight the reality of what this individual is in terms of the public eye of masculinity or femininity from a purist position. So I still don't think he was as beneficial as he could have been, and I don't particularly agree with the tactics.
So I've got several things to say to that, because I really see your heart in what you're saying, and I think that I'm my initial reaction is usually where you're at right now, but I feel like I have learned in recent times, especially, that there is, when these type of discussions are had, especially in this type of a medium of, a podcast. First, it was Matt Walsh, reacting to this character. This character has been in the news for months now. And he has amassed, as Susie Q said, he's amassed a ton of money from his role as an influencer. So in these mediums, Matt is speaking not necessarily to save Dylan Mulvaney, which obviously we would pray for. But once upon a reset in the chat said, how redeemable is someone who has a seared conscience? And I'm using that chat to say that it's kind of goes into my point, which is that I don't think Dylan Mulvaney is going to be saved by anything Matt Walsh says, most likely. Not to say that it's impossible, but the likelihood
you're exactly right. Yeah.
is very small. And so ultimately what these type of debates are for is the benefit of those in the middle who are undecided, or maybe who are leaning a certain way but could be convinced. And one of the things that I know Matt has talked about in response to this as well, that I didn't have the ability to pull the whole transcript because that would have been just way too long, but he has talked about the Overton window. And in fact, I believe that was mentioned in a chat just a moment ago too. Yeah, once upon a reset, the Overton window is in play big time when it comes to how far society has fallen and how we define and redefine what depravity actually means. So now, Michael, are you familiar with the Overton window, like what it means roughly? So the Overton window is basically, this is the Overton window, and everything that is within the Overton window is what is considered acceptable dialogue to talk about. So on the fringes of things are things that if someone said in polite society, everyone would be like, how dare you say that? And so to some degree, there is a play being made and has honestly been dominated by the left, where the left has moved the Overton window to the left. And what Walsh has even said is that he is trying to get to a point where we can re-normalize the idea that it's weird to do what Dylan Mulvaney said. And he has also mentioned a point that he's mentioned in the longer response that he said, many of my critics say, Matt, you seem angry. And he said, I am angry. I am angry that there are people like Dylan Mulvaney that amass a bunch of influence and go to the White House and tell Joe Biden that he needs to do a better job of getting minors access to these gender transition surgeries, which are irreversible. I don't care who says that they're not. I think that they are irreversible. Maybe some things can be healed to a degree, but there's no reversing all of the effects of that kind of drastic procedure. And so he is definitely attempting to shift the Overton window, which is a lot of where his harshness comes from. And in addition to that, he did a good job of reminding the audience that Dylan Mulvaney is not a victim in this. I mean, obviously we could say he's a victim in regards to, we believe that there is a darker force. We believe in an enemy that is the father of all lies, and Dylan is succumbed by these lies. But at the end of the day, he is an adult that is making this choice, that is now trying to advocate for more children to fall down this trail. And that's where we can look to scriptures and say, the millstone, we should not lead children astray. It's better for a millstone to be tied around a person's neck. And so to some degree, there is a righteous anger, I think, that Walsh is having. Now, we could argue tactics, but I think less confrontational individuals like you and I are quick to think about, oh, well, that's not going to make Dylan feel good or Dylan's audience feel good. But I believe Matt is sending this message knowing that he's not going to reach Dylan. He's hoping to reach and re-normalize, essentially stigmatizing Dylan's lifestyle, because it used to be stigmatized just like 5 years ago in our culture.
Yeah. Well, hear me, please, when I say I am not defending Dylan, and I am not protecting his autonomy or choices. And certainly, either his salvation or his judgment will be by the hand of the Lord and not my own or Matt Walsh. I also am not thinking that Matt Walsh should play the Jesus character necessarily.
Right.
I think I want to be clear that the point of my argument that his methods are not as effective as they could have been is on a basis of his influence. And he's limiting his influence to those who are at most risk by creating a greater division where he's pushing people further away, where I think he would be more effective identifying the evidence of the abuse and manipulation that Dylan has to the people that he is influencing because of his actions. And even in the chat here, what Shara Joel said, as a woman, I'm disgusted that Dylan's idea of girlhood is crying for no reason, buying clothes he couldn't afford, and being passive aggressive. Any other man would be branded a misogynist.
Yep.
That, I think, is a much more relevant and effective line of argument than writing a character piece on how Dylan should feel about himself or perceive his own condition of masculinity or femininity.
Yeah.
So that's my argument, is that I just don't think Matt Walsh was as effective as he could have been.
And real quick, I will insert and say that I realize you're not nearly as familiar with Matt's other work as I am. I follow him a lot closer because, and for those of you who are, fairly new to our format still, Michael does not keep up with the news very much. Oftentimes he's responding to things as I am laying them out. I'm kind of more of the individual who's aware of the news, whereas Michael is much more focused on the academics of theology. And so we kind of try to pair our gifts together in that regard. And part of the show is the fact that Michael is someone who is not constantly keeping up on the news, but is able to have these conversations. And I think that's fruitful to see someone work it out kind of in real time, oftentimes in these conversations. So that being said, I'm way more familiar with Matt's work, and
I know
will say that
to build the argument outside of this particular.
Yes, exactly. And that was my point, is everything that you're kind of criticizing him of in that regard, I can say that he's covered those bases, but obviously it's in this context with everything I've given you.
I'm worried that the division that comes from this particular instance will undermine the effectiveness of his arguments that he's already made elsewhere.
Yeah, and I can see the fear of that. I would also say that something I've been thinking about a lot lately because of this, because there are a lot of individuals who I also follow and respect that were also like saying kind of similar to what you were saying about Walsh. And I was really thinking about it. And to be honest, I think kind of like you mentioned earlier about how we're not all called to do the same thing. I think that every tool belt needs a hammer, and Matt Walsh is a hammer. And to guys like me, who is more of a straight edge, or or an X-Acto knife maybe, we can't understand the hammer all the time. But I'm doing my best to, because I will say that for Matt Walsh's part, he has been one of the most effective people actually successfully pushing back against this. And that was something he brought up, talking about renormalizing the stigmatization of these lifestyles. He has said, yeah, I want people to think that Dylan Mulvaney is weird, because he is. And Matt released his documentary, What is a Woman? And he followed it up with an expose on Vanderbilt Hospital, who are doing transitions for children, basically under the table. And they basically said, well, it wasn't under the table, but they basically said that they were only doing it because it was a big cash cow. And we talked about that in a very early episode of our show. And now, as a result of a lot of the pressure directly from Matt Walsh and the movement he's been starting, Tennessee, at the start of the show, we talked about, they banned these all-age drag shows and gender transition surgeries. Mississippi immediately followed Tennessee. And I believe that there are several other states that are actively working to do these things. And Matt Walsh was actually invited to speak in Mississippi during the signing, because basically he's being credited as the main guy pressuring these individuals to actually ban these things. So that's where, like, there's this hard struggle of, I completely feel you, because I'm that way too, where I'm not so blunt. But then you also look and say, what is actually being effective? And yes, he's probably not being effective at reaching Dylan Mulvaney, but he's being effective at stopping a lot of the evil actions that Dylan Mulvaney is advocating for, actively advocating for. And so, and to some degree, he's put himself in opposition to Dylan Mulvaney and has made it to where he's basically closed the drawbridge on a relationship with Dylan, in exchange for being able to stop Dylan from hurting more children with his influence. And
I think it's essentially a battle. Never going to be buddies.
Right. And I guess what it really is he stepped in the ring to pick a fight with Dylan because he felt like Dylan was being an abuser. And as Susie Q pointed out in the chat, I honestly, he's pointed out in his past episodes the same thing. He's honestly misogynistic in the way he portrays what being a woman is. He does say things that would honestly be really offensive if I was a woman, because he's saying, whoa, what womanhood is being emotional and being afraid of bees and buying clothes that I can't afford. And, and it's a caricature. And to some degree, this is a guy that's abusing his platform. And I think Matt Walsh was like, all right, fine, I'm going to clock you. And you and I, who are not the type of people that want to go and throw hands, are quick to be like, cringe at it. But then when you look at the downstream results, it's like, it's hard to argue with it. Not to say that, Dylan doesn't also need someone to reach out to him. But unfortunately, I'm sure that there are people that already have that probably were not successful. But go ahead.
No, it comes down to my limited perspective on what all Dylan is and does. I also, like, my instinct is to say I'm not in opposition to everything else Matt Walsh has done. And certainly he's not been nice all the time either. The idea of the hammer, it makes me think of Ben Shapiro's description of Donald Trump, that he's a hammer looking for a nail. And sometimes he hits a nail and sometimes he hits a baby. That's how he describes Donald Trump all the time. And I think it'd be better to hit the nails more than the babies. And
of course,
if you want to put Matt Walsh into that idea, of course, is a stretch. But I'm not saying that what he's done is not been effective. I'm not saying that his net value isn't great.
Right.
I'm just saying I don't think it is a net positive. In this particular instance, it's hard to see the benefit. And maybe God's working in that. We need people who are sharper edged and willing to be harsh.
Yeah.
And I would even, this is neither here nor there, but I would say that I'm very confrontational by nature, more so than most people that I have in my life. And I'm usually one to jump out and take it on the chin, but also dish it out as well. I just don't know the context well enough. And maybe if I got to know the work of Dylan Mulvaney, I might feel differently. So
yeah,
I don't know. I think that's just my initial reaction, is that I think not about what, I think less about what Dylan thinks of this than of what all of the thousands of kids who are being persuaded to identify with him are feeling about it. That's I think more of my heart, and why initially it's unpleasant, and I disagree with I disagree with the tactics, but I don't have the full picture either. So how can I make a better plan?
Yeah. And that's fair. And I was hoping to get your initial take, your initial reaction, unfiltered. And
you got it.
Because it's helpful, because I think many people are going to listen to only that snippet, and that's what you're talking about. If they listen to just that one snippet, are they going to be damaged? And some might be. But, hopefully enough people can kind of look through and get full context, because I think in context, it's a lot more understandable. Because if you don't know who Dylan is, you might think, oh, that's really harsh. But if you knew who Dylan is, well, you might not think it. Or if you knew everything Matt Walsh has said in the past, you might not think it. But I know
Dylan, to
Susie
have the
Q.
platform that he has, he clearly has enough people empathizing with him that there are a lot of other people that take an attack against him as an attack against themselves. And maybe that's good. Maybe they need to be roughed up a little bit. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's hard to tell.
It is hard to tell. And we'll see as this train that our culture is on keeps chugging. Mm-hmm. But Susie Q had said, we don't hear you defending Dylan. You think a different approach would have been more effective, and it's possible that you are correct. And I think that's just good to read out there. And then Once Upon a Reset said, the word of God has already given us a standard. How close/far are we going to stray from this established standard? Then Shara said, look up detransition stories online. They are heartbreaking. Maybe if someone had told them the cold, hard truth, they might have made different decisions. And that's,
sure enough.
That's exactly it. That's exactly where I think there is some positive results from blunt truth. But we're gonna wrap up here in a moment, but I wanted to go ahead and let all of you who are watching this know to follow us on Rumble and Twitter as well. Those are other platforms that we are on. We did get our first bit of censorship. We had a video taken down for discussing things. I believe it was something our guest said, to be honest. And so we would appreciate you checking us out on those other sites as well, because I think that there will come a day where if this censorship ramps up, that Overton window we discussed will eventually boot us off of here. And I think that it's only a matter of time before even individuals who are less spicy in terms of topic choices as we are will also get booted just for doing things like speaking biblically on YouTube. And we got to build alternate off ramps. So follow us there: Rumble, Forge, and Anvil, Twitter, Forge, and A. And then, of course, you can keep following us here too. But maybe a good idea to set up another account so that if we randomly are gone one day, you can still find us. We would really appreciate that. We do stream live on all those platforms. Well, we will be working on Twitter. I guess that's a new thing. And we'll stay on YouTube as long as we can, as long as they'll have us. But, unfortunately, I think it was something our guest said. And I'm not going to tell our guests that they can't say things because I don't think that's fair. And unfortunately, I don't think it's fair either for me to be censored for something that a guest said, but it just is what it is. So, just be aware of that. We would appreciate that support. Susie Q said, congratulations. That means you're saying the right things. Well, I hope so, Susie Q. I think the hard thing is just people not wanting to follow on alt platforms because they're not as good. They're not as pretty. They're not as flashy, but it takes time. Not everyone has a couple decades plus government money to build up their brand like some of these other platforms. So, go find us there on Rumble and Twitter and keep following us here as well. We actually are going to be talking to a guest next week who actually got to the point that most YouTubers are striving to get to when they're so new, where they finally get to the point where they are able to be monetized. He was actually rejected. They said that he had hateful content on his platform and he was just rejected. And everything that he was talking about was basically the stuff we discussed tonight. So there's also a possibility that we could grow on YouTube. You guys could support us, love us, be the best audience ever. And then we finally get to the point where we can apply to be monetized on YouTube and they'll just say no. So, I truly think in this day and age, a new startup individual content creator needs to build out their platform in multiple areas because unfortunately you can't put all your eggs in one basket. So we would appreciate you guys following us at those other places, even if you don't check there primarily. If you occasionally check in just to make sure we're still alive there, if we ever disappear here, we'd appreciate it. But thank you all for listening. And that next guest that we talked about is John Root from Turning Point. So that should be a fun conversation. And we'll be seeing you guys next Monday to have that conversation, 8 p.m. Central, 9 p.m. Eastern. Michael, where can people find you?
As usual, I'll be studying the nuances of the Greek language painstakingly.
Excellent. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We've been Forge and Anvil.